My name is Isabella, and 3 days ago I buried the love of my life. 3 days ago I thought the worst pain I'd ever feel was watching them lower Thomas's casket into the ground while my 8-year-old son Oliver held my hand, and my 5-year-old daughter Lily asked why Daddy wasn't coming home. I was wrong. The worst pain came when his family showed me who they really were. I was sitting in Thomas's office, trying to figure out how to explain to the children that Daddy's business trips were over forever, when I heard trucks outside. Big trucks. Through the window, I saw men in uniforms carrying boxes and furniture dollies. My heart started racing. There had to be some mistake. Then I heard the front door open without a knock. Victoria Bennett, my mother-in-law, walked into my home like she owned it. Behind her came Harrison, Thomas's older brother, and his wife Penelope. They weren't dressed for mourning anymore. They looked like they were dressed for business. "Isabella," Victoria said, her voice cold as winter. "We need to talk." I stood up, confused. "What's happening outside? Why are there moving trucks in my driveway?" Harrison stepped forward, holding a thick folder of papers. "This house belongs to the Bennett Family Trust. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What are you talking about? This is my home. Thomas and I lived here for 4 years. Our children were born in the bedroom upstairs." Penelope laughed, actually laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. "Your home? Honey, you were just living here because Thomas felt sorry for you. This house has been in the Bennett family for generations." "That's impossible," I said, my voice shaking. "Thomas bought this house for us. We picked it out together. We planted the garden together. Our children's height marks are on the kitchen doorframe." Victoria's eyes were like ice. "Thomas may have been foolish enough to let you play house here, but he's gone now. The adults are in charge." I felt like I was drowning. "I don't understand. We're family. Thomas was your son, your brother. Oliver and Lily are your grandchildren, your nephew and niece." "You," Harrison said, pointing at me like I was something dirty, "are not family. You trapped our brother with a pregnancy and a sob story about your poor little immigrant family." The words cut deep, but I fought back. "I loved Thomas. He loved me. We have children together." "Had," Penelope corrected with a cruel smile. "You had children together. Now you're nothing but a leech who's been sucking our family dry for years." I ran to the kitchen where I kept important papers in a drawer. My hands were shaking as I pulled out our marriage certificate. "Look, we're legally married. I have rights." Victoria barely glanced at the paper. "That piece of paper doesn't mean anything now. Thomas is dead, so your free ride ends here." My free ride? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I gave up my nursing career for Thomas. I took care of this house, raised our children, supported his business trips and long hours. I loved him." "You used him," Harrison said flatly. "And now it's over. The bank accounts are frozen. The credit cards are canceled. You have no claim to anything." That's when I heard Oliver's voice from the stairs. "Mommy, why are there strange men in my room?" My heart broke all over again. I looked up to see my son standing there in his pajamas, holding his favorite stuffed elephant. Behind him, Lily peeked out, her thumb in her mouth. "Get them out of here," Victoria said to the movers. "Box up the children's things. They can take their clothes and toys, nothing else." "You can't do this," I whispered, but even as I said it, I felt powerless. "Where are we supposed to go?" Penelope's voice was like poison. "Frankly, we don't care. Get out and rot somewhere else. You're not our problem anymore." As the movers continued packing our lives into boxes, I held my children close and tried to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Thomas had always promised he'd take care of us. He'd always said his family would come around eventually. But as I watched Victoria directing strangers to pack up my children's bedrooms, I realized Thomas's promises might have died with him. What do you think happened next? Have you ever felt completely powerless when someone you trusted let you down? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for the rest of Isabella's incredible story. 5 years earlier, my life was completely different. I was Isabella Rodriguez, a pediatric nurse at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, and I loved every minute of my job. I worked the night shift, which meant I got to comfort scared children when they couldn't sleep and hold babies whose parents couldn't stay overnight. It wasn't glamorous work, but it filled my heart. That's where I met Thomas Bennett on a rainy Tuesday evening in March. He walked into the pediatric ward looking lost and worried, wearing an expensive suit that was wrinkled like he'd been traveling. He was looking for room 314, where his business partner's 6-year-old daughter was recovering from surgery. "Excuse me," he said, approaching my desk. "I'm looking for Amy Chen's room?" I looked up from my charts and felt something flutter in my chest. He had the kindest brown eyes I'd ever seen, and despite his obvious worry, he smiled when he saw me. "Down the hall, third door on the right," I told him. "Are you family?" "Family friend," he said. "Her dad is my business partner, but he's stuck in meetings in Seattle. I promised I'd check on her." What struck me wasn't that he was handsome, though he was. It wasn't even that his watch probably cost more than I made in 6 months. It was that he genuinely cared about a little girl who wasn't even related to him. I watched him through Amy's door window as he sat beside her bed, reading her a story from a book he'd brought. When she fell asleep, he stayed for another hour, just making sure she wasn't alone. "You didn't have to stay so long," I said when he finally came out. "Kids shouldn't be alone in hospitals," he replied simply. "Thank you for taking such good care of her. I can tell she feels safe with you." That's how it started. Thomas began visiting Amy every evening until she went home, and somehow he always found time to stop by my desk. We talked about everything: his technology company that developed educational software for children, my dream of becoming a nurse practitioner, our families, our hopes. "My family thinks I should marry someone from their social circle," he told me one night. "Someone who went to the right schools and knows which fork to use at fancy dinners." "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think I'd rather be with someone who cares more about helping sick children than using the right fork." Our first real date was at a small Mexican restaurant near my apartment. Thomas had never tried authentic Mexican food, and I loved watching his face light up when he tasted my grandmother's favorite dishes. He asked about my family, my culture, my dreams. He listened like every word mattered. "Tell me about your family," I said. His expression grew complicated. "My mother, Victoria, runs the family like a business. Everything has to maintain the Bennett reputation. My brother Harrison is following in her footsteps. They mean well, but they don't understand that money isn't everything." "What do you want that money can't buy?" I asked. "A real family," he said without hesitation. "Love that isn't conditional on status or appearances. Children who feel safe and loved, not pressured to be perfect." 6 months later, Thomas proposed on the beach at sunset. It wasn't elaborate or showy. He simply took my hand and said, "Isabella, you make me want to be the man I always hoped I could be. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he even finished pulling out the ring. Planning our wedding revealed the first cracks in Thomas's family relationships. Victoria insisted on a guest list of 500 people I'd never met. She wanted the ceremony at the country club, with specific flowers, specific music, a specific everything that had nothing to do with what Thomas and I wanted. "This is ridiculous," Thomas finally exploded during one planning meeting. "We want a small ceremony with people who actually care about us." "Thomas, dear," Victoria said in that icy tone I'd learned to dread, "the Bennett family has certain standards to maintain." "Then maybe Isabella and I will start our own family traditions," Thomas replied firmly. We ended up with a compromise: a beautiful but intimate ceremony with 100 guests. Victoria smiled for the photos, but I caught her whispering to Harrison about that girl and what Thomas sees in her. Harrison pulled Thomas aside before the ceremony. "Are you sure about this? She's very different from us." "That's exactly why I'm sure," Thomas answered. As I walked down the aisle toward Thomas, I thought I was joining a family. I had no idea I was walking into a war. After our honeymoon in Italy, Thomas and I moved into the beautiful house he'd bought for us in Riverside Heights. It was everything I'd ever dreamed of. A white colonial with a wraparound porch, a huge kitchen with granite countertops, and a backyard perfect for children to play in. Thomas insisted I quit my job at the hospital. "I want you to focus on us," he said, spinning me around in our empty living room. "On building our family. You've worked so hard for so long, Isabella. Let me take care of you now." It felt like a fairy tale at first. I spent my days decorating our home, learning to cook Thomas's favorite meals, and dreaming about the children we'd have. When I got pregnant with Oliver 8 months after our wedding, Thomas was over the moon. He talked to my belly every night, telling our baby about all the adventures they'd have together. But slowly, things began to change. Victoria started dropping by unannounced, always with suggestions about how I should be living. "Isabella, dear," she'd say, walking through my kitchen like she was inspecting it, "perhaps you should consider hiring a housekeeper. The Bennett wives have always had help. I like taking care of our home," I'd reply, but she'd just smile that cold smile. "And this garden," she'd continue, looking at the vegetable patch I'd planted. "It's very rustic. Perhaps some roses would be more appropriate for the neighborhood." When Oliver was born, Victoria immediately began planning his future. "He'll attend Riverside Prep, of course, then Harvard, like all Bennett men. We should put him on the waiting list now." "He's 3 days old," I laughed, but Victoria wasn't joking. Thomas traveled more and more for business. His company was growing rapidly, and he was constantly flying to meetings in different cities. I understood it was important, but I felt increasingly isolated in our big house with just baby Oliver for company. "I'm thinking about taking some part-time nursing shifts," I mentioned to Thomas one evening when he returned from a week-long trip to California. "Just a few hours while Oliver naps. I miss helping people." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Isabella, we don't need the money, and Oliver needs his mother home." "It's not about money," I explained. "It's about feeling useful, feeling like myself." Before Thomas could respond, his phone rang. It was Harrison, calling about some urgent business matter. Thomas spent the next hour on the phone, and we never finished our conversation. When Lily was born 2 years later, Victoria's involvement became even more intense. She hired a nanny without asking me, insisting that proper families had help with children. When I protested, she looked at me like I was being unreasonable. "Isabella, you're a Bennett now. You have certain responsibilities. There are charity galas to attend, social obligations to fulfill. You can't do that if you're changing diapers all day." I hated those galas. I'd stand in beautiful dresses that cost more than my family's monthly rent, surrounded by women who spoke in code about people I didn't know and places I'd never been. They were polite to my face, but I caught their whispered conversations about Thomas's little wife and how different she is. Thomas tried to include me in his world, but I felt like I was playing a role I didn't understand. When I suggested we visit my family for Christmas, Victoria immediately planned a Bennett family gathering for the same weekend. "Surely your family understands that Thomas has obligations," she said sweetly. The worst part was watching Thomas change. The man who used to ask about my dreams and listen to my stories became distracted and stressed. He'd come home from trips exhausted, spend hours on phone calls, and fall asleep without really talking to me. "Is everything okay with the business?" I asked one night after he'd been particularly quiet. "Just growing pains," he said. But I noticed he'd started locking his office door and taking calls in private. I began to feel like a stranger in my own life. I had everything I thought I wanted: a beautiful home, healthy children, financial security. But I felt empty inside. I missed my independence, my career, my sense of purpose. One evening, I overheard Thomas on the phone with Harrison, talking about updating his will and protecting his assets. When I asked about it later, he brushed it off. "Just business stuff, Isabella, don't worry about it." But I was starting to worry about everything. The phone call came at 2:47 in the morning on a Thursday in October. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the clock, wondering why Thomas hadn't called to say he'd landed safely in Chicago. He always called when he arrived somewhere, no matter how late. "Mrs. Bennett?" The voice was professional, careful. "This is Officer Martinez with the Illinois State Police. I'm calling about your husband, Thomas Bennett." My blood turned to ice. "What's wrong? Is he hurt?" "Ma'am, I'm very sorry to inform you that your husband was involved in a fatal car accident this evening. He was pronounced dead at the scene." The phone slipped from my hand. I heard the officer's voice calling my name, but it sounded like it was coming from underwater. Thomas was supposed to be home tomorrow. We were going to take the kids to the pumpkin patch this weekend. He'd promised Lily he'd help her pick out the biggest pumpkin for carving. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, arrangements, and people I barely knew taking over my life. Victoria arrived at my house within hours, bringing Harrison and Penelope with her. They immediately began making decisions about everything. "The funeral will be at St. Catherine's Cathedral," Victoria announced, not asking for my opinion. "Harrison has already spoken with Father Williams. The service will be Saturday at 11. "But Thomas wasn't really religious," I said weakly. "He always said he preferred the small church where we got married." "The Bennett family has used St. Catherine's for generations," Victoria replied firmly. "Thomas would want to maintain family traditions." I was too devastated to argue. Oliver kept asking when Daddy was coming home, and Lily wouldn't stop crying. I could barely function, let alone plan a funeral for hundreds of people I didn't know. Harrison took charge of all the legal matters. "Don't worry about the complicated business stuff," he told me. "I'll handle Thomas's affairs. You just focus on grieving and taking care of the children." When I asked about Thomas's will, Harrison patted my shoulder like I was a child. "Everything will be handled properly, Isabella. Thomas made sure his family would be taken care of." I noticed strange things happening around the house. Victoria and Harrison spent hours in Thomas's office with the door closed. When I tried to go in, Victoria gently but firmly guided me away. "You shouldn't be dealing with business papers right now, dear. It's too overwhelming." I saw them carrying boxes of documents to Harrison's car. When I asked what they were doing, Harrison explained they were securing important business files and protecting Thomas's legacy. The funeral was exactly what Victoria wanted: grand, formal, and completely unlike the man I'd married. Hundreds of people filled the cathedral, most of them business associates and society figures who barely knew Thomas personally. The flowers were white roses instead of the sunflowers Thomas loved. The music was classical instead of the jazz he enjoyed. Victoria gave a long speech about Thomas's business achievements and the Bennett family legacy. She talked about his contributions to the community and his success in building the family fortune. She mentioned me briefly as Thomas's devoted wife, and the children as the next generation of Bennetts. But it felt like we were footnotes in someone else's story. I sat in the front pew, holding Oliver and Lily, feeling like a stranger at my own husband's funeral. People kept approaching me with condolences, but their words felt empty. They talked about Thomas the businessman, Thomas the Bennett heir, but not Thomas the man who read bedtime stories in funny voices and taught Oliver to ride a bike. After the service, there was a reception at the country club. I wanted to go home with my children, but Victoria insisted it was important to receive the community's support. I stood for hours shaking hands with people who offered sympathy, but looked at me like they were trying to figure out what Thomas had seen in me. That night, after everyone left, I sat in Thomas's office trying to feel close to him. But all his personal things were gone. His desk was empty. Even his favorite coffee mug had disappeared. I had no idea that while I was grieving my husband, his family was already planning to erase me from his life completely. The Sunset Motel on Highway 9 was nothing like the home I'd shared with Thomas. The carpet was stained, the walls were thin, and the air conditioning unit made a grinding noise that kept us all awake. But it was all I could afford with the $43 I had in my purse when Victoria's security guards escorted us out. Oliver sat on one of the two narrow beds, still clutching his stuffed elephant, staring at the peeling wallpaper. "Mommy, when can we go home?" he asked for the 100th time. "I don't know, baby," I whispered, because I couldn't lie to him anymore. Lily had cried herself to sleep, asking for her daddy and her pink bedroom with the Princess Castle nightlight. I'd managed to grab some of their clothes and toys, but everything else, their bikes, their books, the growth chart on the kitchen door, was gone. I called my sister Carmen from the motel's payphone, my hands shaking as I dialed. "Isabella, oh my God, what's wrong? You sound terrible." When I told her what happened, Carmen was silent for a long moment. Then she exploded. "They did what? Those monsters threw you out? With the kids?" "Carmen, I don't know what to do. I have no money, no car, nowhere to go. I'm driving down there right now. Don't you dare leave that motel until I get there." Carmen arrived 6 hours later, her old Honda packed with groceries and her own children's outgrown clothes for Oliver and Lily. She took one look at the motel room and started crying. "This is insane, Isabella. You're Thomas's wife. Those are his children. How can they just throw you away like garbage? They said I have no legal rights, that everything belonged to the Bennett family trust." Carmen, who worked 2 jobs as a single mother, emptied her wallet to pay for another week at the motel. "We'll figure this out," she promised, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She had her own kids to support and couldn't carry us forever. I tried calling people I thought were friends, but quickly realized they were really Thomas's friends. His golf partner's wife was suddenly too busy to talk. The woman who used to invite me to book club said she'd heard about my situation and thought it was best if we didn't get involved in family matters. Even worse was trying to find work. I went to the local hospital where I'd hoped to return to nursing, but my license had expired. Getting it renewed would take months and cost money I didn't have. The administrator looked at my resume with its 4-year gap and shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett, but we need nurses with current experience." I applied at restaurants, retail stores, anywhere that would hire someone with no recent work history. Most places took one look at my expensive clothes, the only ones I had, and assumed I wasn't serious about working. "Why do you want to work here?" asked the manager at a fast food restaurant. "Aren't you one of those rich ladies from Riverside Heights?" "I need the job," I said simply, but he didn't believe me. The worst moment came when I had to pawn my wedding ring. The jeweler barely looked at it before offering me $200 for a ring that had cost Thomas thousands. "It's not about the money," I told him. "This ring means everything to me." "Lady, if it meant everything, you wouldn't be here," he replied coldly. But I needed formula for Lily and food for Oliver, so I handed over the symbol of my marriage to Thomas and walked out with cash that would last maybe 2 weeks. Meanwhile, I watched Harrison on the local news, standing in front of Thomas's company building, talking about continuing Thomas's legacy and the Bennett family's commitment to the community. The reporter asked about Thomas's family, and Harrison mentioned the tragic loss, but said nothing about me or the children. That night, as I lay awake listening to my children sleep fitfully in the strange bed, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, hoping someone would help us. I had to fight back, even if I didn't know how. The next morning, I found a legal aid office in the phone book. It was time to find out what rights I really had and what the Bennett family was hiding. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was feeding Lily cereal that Carmen had bought with her grocery money. The motel phone rang, and I almost didn't answer it. Most calls were from bill collectors or people wanting to sell me things I couldn't afford. "Mrs. Bennett, this is Frederick Ashworth from Ashworth Associates. I was your husband's attorney." My heart started pounding. Yes? "I need to see you immediately. Can you come to my office today?" "Mr. Ashworth, I don't have a car and I can't afford—" "Mrs. Bennett," his voice was urgent. "This cannot wait. I'll send a car for you." An hour later, a black sedan picked me up from the motel. I felt embarrassed about my wrinkled clothes and the fact that I smelled like the motel's cheap soap, but the driver was polite and didn't ask questions. Ashworth's law office was in a tall glass building downtown, the kind of place I used to visit with Thomas for business meetings. The receptionist looked surprised when I gave my name, like she wasn't expecting someone who looked like me. Mr. Ashworth was a distinguished man in his late 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When I walked into his office, his expression immediately shifted to concern. "Mrs. Bennet, please sit down. Can I get you some coffee? Water?" I accepted the coffee gratefully. It was the first good coffee I'd had in weeks. "Mrs. Bennet, I have to ask, where are you living right now?" The question caught me off guard. We're staying at a motel. Why?" His face darkened. "A motel? You and the children?" "Yes, sir. Since they said I had to leave the house." Mr. Ashworth set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. "Mrs. Bennet, who told you that you had to leave your home?" "Victoria and Harrison. They said the house belonged to the family trust, and that I had no rights to anything." "And they told you this when?" 3 days after the funeral. They came with moving trucks and security guards." Mr. Ashworth's jaw tightened. "Did anyone contact you about reading Thomas's will?" I felt confused. Harrison said there was no will, just family trust documents. The silence that followed was so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. Mr. Ashworth walked to his safe and pulled out a thick legal document. "Mrs. Bennet," he said slowly, "your husband updated his will just 2 months before his death. He specifically requested that I contact you immediately after the funeral for a formal reading." The room started spinning. "But Harrison said, Harrison Bennet has been lying to you." Mr. Ashworth's voice was cold with anger. "Thomas left very specific instructions about his estate, and none of them involve you being homeless." He opened the will and began reading sections aloud. With each word, I felt like I was waking up from a nightmare. "To my beloved wife Isabella, I leave our family home and all personal property contained within—" My hands started shaking. "I also leave to Isabella 80% of my shares in Bennett Technologies, ensuring she has financial independence and control over our family's future." I couldn't breathe. "Furthermore, I establish a $50 million education trust for our children, Oliver and Lily, with Isabella as the sole trustee." "$50 million?" I whispered. Mr. Ashworth nodded grimly. "Your husband was worth considerably more than his family led you to believe, and he made sure you and the children would be protected." He picked up his phone and made several calls, his voice growing more stern with each conversation. I heard him mention fraud, theft, and criminal charges. "Mr. Ashworth," I said when he hung up, "why didn't you contact me sooner?" His expression was pained. "Harrison told me you were too distraught to handle legal matters and that the family was taking care of everything. He said you'd requested privacy and didn't want to be bothered with business details. I should have insisted on speaking with you directly. What happens now?" Mr. Ashworth's smile was grim but satisfied. "Now, Mrs. Bennet, we're going to have a proper will reading. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. And I guarantee you, the Bennet family is going to be very unhappy with what they hear." As I rode back to the motel, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The next morning, I borrowed Carmen's best dress and walked into Mr. Ashworth's conference room, feeling nervous but determined. The room was elegant, with dark wood paneling and a long mahogany table. I took a seat near the window, watching the door and waiting. Victoria arrived first, wearing a black designer suit and her usual expression of cold authority. She stopped dead when she saw me. "What is she doing here?" Victoria demanded. "Good morning, Mrs. Bennet," Mr. Ashworth replied calmly. "Please take a seat." Harrison and Penelope entered next, both looking annoyed. Harrison's face turned red when he spotted me. "Frederick, I told you Isabella wasn't ready for legal proceedings. She's been having a difficult time coping." "Has she?" Mr. Ashworth's voice was ice cold. "Please, everyone sit down." Victoria glared at me across the table. "I don't know what game you're playing, Isabella, but this is highly inappropriate. You should be home with the children, not bothering Mr. Ashworth with your emotional problems." "Actually," Mr. Ashworth said, opening the thick will document, "Mrs. Isabella Bennet has every right to be here. She is, after all, the primary beneficiary of her husband's estate." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison's face went from red to pale in seconds. "That's impossible," Penelope whispered. "The family trust—" "There is no family trust that supersedes Thomas's will," Mr. Ashworth interrupted. Now, shall we begin? As he read Thomas's will aloud, I watched the Bennett family's faces change from confusion to shock to pure horror. When he reached the part about the house, Victoria gripped the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "This house cannot be left to her," Victoria said desperately. "It's been in our family for generations." Actually, Mrs. Bennett, Thomas purchased that house with his own money after his marriage. It was never part of any family property. When Mr. Ashworth read about the 80% business shares, Harrison stood up so fast his chair fell over. "This is fraud. She manipulated him. Thomas would never—" "Sit down, Mr. Bennett," Mr. Ashworth said firmly. "I'm not finished." The $50 million trust fund announcement made Penelope actually gasp out loud. Victoria looked like she might faint. But the real shock came when Mr. Ashworth pulled out a sealed letter. "Thomas also left this explanation for his decisions," he said, opening the envelope. He wrote, "I discovered that my family attempted to manipulate Isabella into signing documents that would have stripped her of her rights as my wife. They also made plans to contest any will that favored her over family members. This will is my protection for the woman I love, and our children, who deserve better than the coldness and greed I grew up with." Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. That little gold digger poisoned his mind against us. "Furthermore," Mr. Ashworth continued, "Thomas suspected that family members might attempt to hide or alter his will after his death. He took precautions." Harrison's face was now completely white. "What kind of precautions?" "He had me file copies with 3 different law firms and the probate court. He also documented every conversation he had with family members about Isabella and his estate plans." Mr. Ashworth picked up his phone and made a call. "Yes, they're all here. You can come up now." 2 police officers entered the conference room. Harrison tried to stand, but his legs seemed to give out. "Harrison Bennett," the first officer said, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and theft. You have the right to remain silent." As they handcuffed Harrison, Penelope started crying. "We didn't mean for it to go this far. We thought she didn't deserve—" "Deserve what?" I asked quietly. "To be loved? To be protected? To have a home for my children?" Victoria looked at me with pure hatred. "You've destroyed this family." "No," I said, standing up. "You destroyed yourselves. Thomas saw who you really were, and he protected us from you." 3 months later, I was back in our home with Oliver and Lily. I'd returned to nursing school and started a scholarship fund for children from immigrant families. Harrison was serving 2 years in prison for his crimes. Victoria and Penelope had moved away, unable to face the scandal. Thomas's final gift wasn't just the money or the house. It was freedom from people who never saw my worth, and the strength to build a life based on love instead of fear. My children would grow up knowing their father loved them enough to protect them, even after he was gone.